It is the second day of this round of ceasefire talks to try to end the war against Gaza, return Israeli hostages, and heat off a wider war in the Middle East. This time, though, Hamas is not even at the bargaining table. That's because Israel assassinated Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran last month, with Iran vowing to retaliate. The stakes in Qatar this round are even higher. And this latest round, an Israeli delegation speaking to mediators from the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, Hamas has signaled through intermediaries a willingness to consider new proposals. We turn now to the Quincy Institute's Trita Parsi to weigh in on whether or not this round of talks stands a chance. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Trita, the dire situation in Gaza has now reached a very grim milestone. This week, the Palestinian Health Authority has reported that more than 40,000 Gazans have been killed. Can you explain what this means for us and what this means for the ceasefire talks?
Well, the killing and slaughter in Gaza continues, and the numbers are most likely far beyond that because the way the Gaza authorities are counting this are confirmed deaths by people who have been brought into the hospitals. It does not count missing people, and there are plenty of people missing in the rubble after all of the different bombs and the buildings that have been destroyed by those bombs in Gaza. So the number is most likely much, much higher. One study puts it at potentially around 180,000, which is just a staggering number of people being killed, mindful of the fact that the vast majority are civilians, women, and children. Now, there is additional pressure for this round of talks to work. And that pressure is that the Iranians have essentially signaled that if there is an achievement at this round in which a ceasefire is secured, they may not retaliate against Israel for having assassinated the Hamas leader on Iranian soil in Tehran during the inauguration of the new Iranian president. However, we are close in the sense of, there's a lot of talk about it being close, but what we're not hearing is that the United States is close to using its leverage in order to secure a deal. We're not seeing any signals from the administration that they're willing to withhold arms shipments to Israel in order to press it towards a ceasefire. And this has been the crucial missing piece. I think we should remember that when the Biden administration presented its plan, it actually said that this was Israel's plan. When it took it to the UN Security Council, it argued that Israel had already agreed to this plan. And as a result, we just needed a Security Council and pressure on Hamas. Reality is that was all false. It was not Israel's plan, nor had Israel agreed to it. So if we truly want to get the Israelis to come to an agreement on this, I really find it extremely unlikely to occur unless the Biden administration is willing to use the leverage that it does have.
I want to read a little bit from a statement we just received this morning. It's a joint statement from the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. It says, earlier today in Doha, the United States presented to both parties a bridging proposal that is consistent with the principles laid out by President Biden. Working teams will continue technical work over the coming days on the details of implementation, including arrangements to implement the agreement's extensive humanitarian provisions, as well as specifics relating to hostages and detainees. Senior officials from our governments will reconvene in Cairo before the end of next week with the aim to conclude the deal under the terms put forward today. I just want to get your reaction to this breaking news, Trita.
I don't find it to really be breaking news because there's nothing of substance in that statement that give any suggestion that anything is happening. However, I think there is a value in it in a limited way, which is that as long as these talks are going on and there's some hint of some progress, it can hold off an Iranian retaliation against Israel. And the reason why that is good is because that retaliation likely can cause the Israelis to escalate matters further and bring us into a larger war. However, this can only work if there actually is some real progress. If it is just a machine that pumps out these press releases, but there's actually nothing happening in terms of moving towards a ceasefire, all the while the Israelis are continuing to slaughter people, then this is not going to work. And eventually the Iranians will likely take some form of an action against Israel in retaliation, in response to what the Israelis did in Tehran. So on the one hand, I can understand that the administration wants to beef up diplomacy right now in order to have it work as a de-escalatory element. But that can only work if these negotiations are actually serious and brings about some form of a change. That won't happen. I'm going to repeat myself, but that won't happen unless the U.S. then also puts pressure on Israel by using withholding of arms transfers to Israel. Absent that, we have not seen any sign in the last 10 months that the Israelis are willing to go for a ceasefire.
And a follow-up, if I may, why has Hamas refused to sit down in Doha, and does Israel care that they're not at the table? I mean, how does the absence of these parties affect the negotiations? And is there any indication that Israel will attend later on in this process in Cairo?
Well, I think part of what Hamas is saying in terms of this is that, the U.S. said that Israel had already agreed to this deal. So if there's a deal that Israel has agreed to, Hamas has agreed to, why is there a need for additional round of talks? And I'll add to that, of course, given that Israel assassinated their previous top negotiator, this is probably also factoring into Hamas's decision. It does not mean, however, that negotiations cannot take place without Hamas being at the table, because at the end of the day, the Qataris and the Egyptians can talk to Hamas and it can be an indirect negotiation. But there is a point in what they're saying, which is, why are we having an additional round of talks if Israel already had agreed to the previous package that Biden had put forward, and even stated that Israel had agreed to it as a way of securing an approval in the Security Council for it?
Now, as we reach milestone after milestone of civilians killed in Gaza, the response from the State Department and Defense Department in the United States is typically any amount of civilian deaths is too much. When we point out the destruction and the leveling of neighborhoods, it's Israel will investigate that. Hamas is using these buildings as command centers. When it's, entire neighborhoods and cities leveled. If the war ended today, how long and how much would it take to rebuild Gaza? And who's going to be responsible for ensuring it? I don't think there's any hope, but is there any hope for the current generation of children who've grown up in war to live in a free Palestine? We've also heard that Israel is not okay with a Gaza controlled by an independent government post-war.
So in the beginning of this conflict, there was a lot of focus on what would happen after the conflict. And I think that was misguided, because it was premised on the idea that somehow the Israelis would be able to take out Hamas quickly. And as a result, we would move towards a post-conflict stage. 10, 11 months into it, we're nowhere near a post-conflict stage. And we have an entire generation of young Gazans who have either been killed or traumatized for life, and many, many of them probably also radicalized for life. All of this is actually not making Israel any safer, it's making Israel less safe. On top of that, every time there is an atrocity, every time that there has been a case in which the Israelis have targeted a family, as was the case with these two 4-day-old twins, in a targeted strike even, and the United States says, well, Israel should investigate it. Every time the State Department or the Pentagon or the White House says this, the United States loses credibility on the international stage. And for 10 months straight now, we have been losing credibility, because the contradiction, the double standards, the hypocrisy between what we're saying on Gaza and what we're saying on Ukraine could not be any more clear for the world to see. And that in and of itself undermines U.S. security and the U.S.'s ability to continue to lead where it feels that it needs to lead in the future. So this has been tremendously damaging to the U.S. itself. Nothing in compared to, of course, what the Palestinians have suffered for the last 10 months. But there is absolutely no U.S. interest at stake here that justifies the Biden administration's continuous protection of Israeli war crimes.
I want to pivot a little bit to the political perspective, because we do have an election coming up. From your perspective, would either a Harris-Walz or Trump-Vance ticket, or administration rather, do things differently than what we're seeing now?
I think both of them would do it differently. I don't think any of them are going to continue the exact same policy and this unprecedented degree of deference that the Biden administration has shown the Netanyahu government and Israel as a whole. But exactly how they differ, it's really difficult to tell. We're in an election season, so a lot of parties are going to say things because it's elections and they may sound good, but perhaps not follow up on them. But I do think that it was quite fascinating that Trump claimed to have spoken to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is denying this, and in that had told him, you have to finish this up, get your win, but the killing has to stop. I don't see what the political benefit is for Trump to go out and say this if he actually didn't say it. So I think there's a degree of credibility in the fact that he said something along those lines. And I think what it points to is that both Harris and Trump have an interest in making sure that Netanyahu does not escalate this into a larger war before they come into office. And they also have an interest in making sure that the war itself in Gaza ends, because the slaughter in Gaza is what fuels the risk of a larger war. Neither a President Harris or a President Trump want to step into office in January and have to deal with a mess in the Middle East in which Israel may have dragged the United States into yet another unnecessary, unjustified war in that region.
Trita Parsi with the Quincy Institute. Always great to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.